All right. Before we start, you know, there's almost no overlap between the people who were here last week and the people who are here this week. It's a very interesting thing teaching a Sunday school class that does not suspend itself during Christmas and New Year's vacation. So I left a question out there for people to think about last week, which none of you have had a chance to think about, and the people who haven't had a chance to think about it aren't here this week. So we'll see how this goes.
Why does anyone love Job?
Yes, it's why does anyone love Job?
Were you here?
That's right.
You should have thought about it.
But I have to tell a story on my 14-year-old daughter. This is the first time that I haven't had any family members here. My wife is having to be with her mother today. Her mother was not happy about being alone in the Mandarin service, so I don't think my wife's going to be good the rest of the time. But my daughter Mary has been in the class most of the time, and so there's been a lot of discussion that's kept going on at home, and my 14-year-old got interested in it, so she actually came last week. And one of the things we talked about last week was the question of why Job got in trouble for asking why all this bad stuff was happening to him, which sort of can make you nervous, since that's the first thing we do when something bad happens to us, right? Is we say, why did this happen? And one of the answers that one of the groups came up with was that his attitude was bad, which I think does have a lot to do with it. And I used the example of kids asking for something with a bad attitude. And said, you know, if you demand an answer, that's a good way to not get one. If you demand it instead of asking. So we wound up with the question of why doesn't anyone love Job? And so I said, you guys can think about it and we'll talk about it next week. And as soon as everybody cleared out, my wife immediately came up to me. So everyone's gone except my family. And my wife comes up to me and she starts saying, is it because of this? Is it because he spent so much time that he didn't have time with his family? Is it because? And I said, well, those are pretty good answers, but I'm going to let you think about it for a week. And she said, no, tell me the answer. And I said, no, you should, I'll let you think about it. She said, tell me. And all of a sudden Sally says, hey, that's a demand. What Sally doesn't realize is that the next time she demands an answer, I'll say, I know you know. I know you understood. Because you could tell that's what the other was doing. So, there it is. I'm very scatterbrained this morning. I don't know why. Hopefully it's going to improve as we go. And maybe it won't. This is not a encouraging start. Slideshow. It's not like PowerPoint is complicated to run. All right. Let's start with a story. A long time ago, in the land of Israel, there lived a young man who loved stories. He loved listening to stories. He loved telling stories. And of course, ancient societies like Greece or like Israel in 700 or 800 BC didn't have a lot in the way of entertainment. And people who were good at telling stories were pretty highly valued, because it was nice to be able to sit around the fire and listen to a really good story told by somebody who really knew how to tell one. And this young man, as he grew up, got better and better at telling stories. He became the kind of person that people would ask him, Jeff, tell us a story. And when he heard the story, that really got a hold of him. He wanted to tell that story well. So he worked on it and crafted it until he had it exactly the way he wanted to tell it. And then, one night, when they said, Jethro, tell us a story, he said, I've got a new one for you. In the land of Ur, there lived a man named Job. Now, I start off that way because we come at the book of Job without even thinking about it in a little bit of the wrong way. Because we think of Job as a Bible character. And when we read the book of Job, we are studying the Bible. We come to Job because we want to learn things about God, right? But the book of Job was not the book of Job didn't come about because a bunch of people were sitting around talking to their professor, to their professor of theology, and they said, "Can you please explain to us why bad things happen to good people?" And he said, "Yeah, I can explain it. Let me tell you a story." The book of Job came about because a storyteller loved the story of Job and wanted to tell it. He wanted to tell it well. We think of Bible characters as being people who tell us something about God. All right? And so we come to the book of Job for the same reason that we go to the letters of Paul, or the same reason that we go to the gospel. We do not read the book of Job for entertainment. But the book of Job was originally written as entertainment. Now, it was serious entertainment, and I would imagine that the audience that was there that first night, the night that Jethro first told that story, got way more than they bargained for, and I would imagine that after it was over, they all got up and they went home very deep in thought. You know, that night they hadn't gotten a romantic comedy, they got this. I would imagine they found it very overwhelming and that they weren't prepared for what they got. But it was originally entertainment in the sense that Othello was originally entertainment, right? That it was written for an audience, and that the people who were reading it went to hear the story first and foremost to be entertained. And we do not read the book of Job for entertainment. We read it because we are studying the Bible. And the guy who wrote the book of Job did not think of himself as writing scripture. He had no idea that he was writing the Bible. Insofar as he had any concept of the Bible at all, his concept of the Bible was the law of Moses. This was true even down to the time of Jesus. So the arguments between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, the Sadducees believed that only the first 5 books of the Old Testament were inspired by God, that was the law of Moses. The Pharisees also thought that God had inspired the prophets. And the Pharisees believed in this concept of the oral law. They believed that God had revealed parts of his will to Moses orally and told him, don't write this down, pass it down orally. And they thought that the oral law, what Jesus or Paul would describe as the traditions, their traditions, had equal authority to the written law. Jesus comes through and he disagrees with the Sadducees' opinion that only the first 5 books count. Jesus clearly affirms the inspiration of the prophets as well. And so the law and the prophets is what we take as the Old Testament. But he emphatically rejects the validity of the oral law. So Jesus manages to make everybody mad at him, right? He doesn't agree with the Sadducees. He doesn't agree with the Pharisees. But Job is one of the oldest books in the Bible. If Jethro was aware of, if Jethro was written after the law of Moses, then the Bible to Jethro was the law of Moses. That's the most that counted for a Bible. And he certainly did not think of himself as adding to it. All right? Now, because of that, because we think of it as the Bible, we have another thing that we tend to do, and this is what we were talking about before class started. We tend to take the fully developed theological terms of the New Testament, things like righteousness or grace, and we tend to assume that when we see the English word righteousness in the book of Job, that it means the same thing that it means in Romans. Because to us it's the same word. Now, first of all, words change meaning across 700 or 800 years of linguistic development, even under ordinary circumstances. In the second place, as we've talked about before, Paul knew a great deal more about God's plan than Jethro did. He knew that Jesus had risen from the dead, for one thing, right? But in this case, we're not even in the same language. It's the same word in English. It's not the same word. Job's not using the same word that Paul does. And the concepts are slightly different. Now, the difference is mostly that the Christian term righteous includes everything that the Hebrew term righteous does, and also some more stuff, because we know more about what pleases God than Jethro did, right? But one of the sort of fundamental interpretive problems for us for Job is that God describes Job as a righteous person, yet Job is clearly very proud and self-righteous. God describes Job as a good and righteous person, but Job clearly has major problems with personal relationships, right? And if we take it for granted that when God says that Job is righteous, that he therefore means that Job is a good Christian, then we run into some contradictions, because Job has some attitudes that we know are wrong, right? But we know that pride is wrong. But do you know why we know that pride is wrong? Because the book of Proverbs has half a dozen places where it says don't be proud. But the book of Proverbs was not part of Job's Bible. Even if the book of Proverbs was around, it wasn't considered part of the Bible yet. Right? So Job was righteous, and God could accurately describe Job as righteous under what this word meant when the book was written. And there isn't any contradiction between the problematic aspects of Job's attitudes and his being described as righteous on his terms. Right? And so what we don't want to do is we don't want to get ourselves tangled up into contradictions by thinking that God's saying more than he is. Right? So, now I'm going to run through this quickly, because this was from last week. We went over this in depth last week, but not everybody was here. Whether you know it or not, you imagine Job with a certain personality. Because you can't read a story and not give the people in the story personalities. If you're actors, as a profession, you have techniques for figuring out what their stories are. But most of us just sort of, without even thinking about it, we kind of assume that the people are more or less like us. But we kind of give them a personality. And it's a personality formed on first impressions. And it's not usually a personality where we've actually gone. So I gave the example of Jesus. When I was a teenager, the Jesus in my Bible spent a lot of time being really angry with the disciples because they were so stupid. The Jesus in my Bible now, when I read it, spends a lot of time just shaking his head and being amused at how clueless his disciples are. And the difference between the two isn't any difference in the text hasn't changed. The difference is that when I was in high school, stupid people really drove me crazy, and I was very uncharitable toward them, and they made me mad. And so every time the disciples were stupid, Jesus really went off on them. And the tone of voice that the Jesus in my Bible used was a pretty rough tone of voice. He lit them up. Now when I read it, I've been a dad for 25 years, and I've spent a lot of time around young children that I really loved who were really clueless. And now Jesus talks to them the way I talk, right? Look, when I was 17, I didn't realize that I was accusing Jesus of being annoyed by stupid people. But that's what I was doing, just by the tone of voice that I heard in my head when Jesus talked. And that's what we don't want to do, right? We don't want to just make come in with some sort of assumption about Job and read him that way without actually looking at the text and trying to figure out what he's doing. So he needs to be a real person, and people need to interact with him in a real way. And also he needs to actually be the person who's in the text, not the person who's sort of in our mind that we project onto. And then the main question that I had about Job, why didn't anybody love him? Obviously, there are people, there's a passage in the first 8 verses of chapter 30 where Job makes fun of people who are so miserably poor that they are having to eat weeds to keep from starving to death. And his attitude towards those people is they have it coming. He holds them in such contempt, he wouldn't even let them be around his sheepdogs. It is a really brutally contemptuous passage. And this is one of the places where we read it, having our idea about how Christians ought to love everybody and everything. We think that's not very righteous. What it reveals is that Job doesn't think there's anything wrong with feeling that way about people who deserve it. He doesn't tell us how he decides how they deserve it. But he clearly thinks these people sort of have it coming, and he doesn't feel any problem with that. Well, those people are happy to kick Job while he's down, and that we can understand. But Job has helped all these people. He's gone to court and helped win justice for widows and orphans. He's given them money when they were starving to death. He's put clothes on them when they were naked. And when Job needs help, none of them show up. None of these people that he's helped so much as bring him a glass of water. One of the reasons we know is that Job complains about the fact that nobody helps him. Right? His friends show up and have remained ever since. Job's friends everybody knows that means friends that you're better off without. His wife just counsels him to commit suicide, and this is going to look like a silly point, and I'm not going to. I defended it at some length last week. I'm not going to deliver it this week, but Job's children don't invite him to their birthday parties. And that's actually a serious point. The narrator goes out of the way to say that every time Job's sons and daughters had a birthday, they invited all their siblings to the party. But they don't invite Job. So the narrator presents us with a righteous man who suffers, whom God allows to suffer inexplicitly, and also who has every single human relationship that he has fails him when he needs it. So you have a righteous man whose human relationships are sufficiently dysfunctional to fail when it matters the most, universally and without exception. So that's where I said, why is that? So a couple of people had a chance to think about it, but does anybody have any thoughts about it? Why would that be? I'm having more trouble today with just simple mechanics. We'll worry about that when we're through talking. Why would that be? Why do you think? Why do you think nobody was there for Job?
So even though God says Job is righteousness, Job is justice, Job is a good man to many, helps to others, to his close friends, to his relatives, but probably Job has a higher standard, has own standards to judge his friends, to ask his friends to do like him to do.
Mm-hmm.
So this way, others fear him.
Mm-hmm.
So don't show up when Job need help.
I think that probably has a lot to do with it. Could you guys hear that? So, do you know where I think that comes most into play? If you ask me why his children don't invite him to the parties, what do you think it was like to grow up as Job's kid? With a father who never did anything wrong, right? Job, there's the one thing that shows that Job loves his kid, and this is a book that's almost entirely without love. There's almost no love in this book anywhere. About the only place where you see any action that could be love is that Job used to, I think every week, he would offer sacrifices on behalf of his kids, right? Presumably because he loves them so much. But the reason that he gives for the sacrifices, maybe they've sinned and don't know it, right? Job doesn't appear to have a whole lot of confidence in his kids' good behavior. Right? He doesn't seem to have a very high opinion of his kids. He feels like he has to sacrifice for them every week just in case, because you don't know what they might have done, right? If your dad has really high standards and doesn't seem very confident that you live up to them, it might not be all that pleasant to be around him, right? Now, obviously, we are guessing and we're filling in the blanks. But you have to, because you're going to, you're going to do it subconsciously, whether you realize it or not. So I think that's certainly Job has a very high standard for other people's behavior. That probably doesn't make him all that easy to be around, right? Well, there are people. So there are people who have very high standards for behavior, and we like them anyway. What is it that makes us like people, even though they have really high standards of behavior?
Their attitude.
Their attitude. I wasn't looking, so I don't know who said it. Jocelyn. So, what is it about their attitude?
They're not condescending or patronizing when they talk to you.
Mm-hmm. I think that's exactly right. So I think both of those are good things. What else? What else might I say? Maybe I should do this. Maybe I should sit in a wheelchair for this lesson.
I mean, I wasn't here, but to me, what I've filled in the blank with is that maybe other people just aren't as generous or kind as he is. So they'll take it, they'll receive it, they won't return.
That, even if you have a very good attitude, some people are going to be ungrateful just because they're ungrateful. It is somewhat surprising that not one of all the people Job's helped showed up, but it would be equally surprising if they all did. Right? I was Helen's instant reaction. Helen didn't react to Job's relationships with his friends at all. She went straight to his family. And her reaction was that she felt like there was a good chance that Job had been so busy running around doing all of his godly stuff that he had taken care of everybody's needs except his family's, and that his family ignored him because he pretty much ignored them. That could certainly very well be. Job obviously spent an enormous amount of time running around doing godly stuff. What else? There's another thing, I don't have it listed up in here. Not that it matters what's listed there, since you can't see it anyway. It is possible, and I honestly don't know enough about, because I didn't go to seminary. I studied classics, so I know Greek culture, but I don't know nearly as much as I should about Hebrew. It is possible that if you thought somebody was being cursed by God, that you stayed away so you wouldn't catch any of it. Right? And that's a very Chinese way to react, for one thing. But I don't think it's peculiar to Chinese culture to worry that bad luck will rub off. And especially if you don't think that it's a matter of bad luck, especially if you think that it's a matter of God is actually mad at the guy. Right? You don't necessarily want to be collateral damage when the lightning strikes. You don't want God to accidentally smite you because you're standing next to him.
Or you could even think he must deserve it.
Mm-hmm.
Be like his friends.
Mhm.
Right? And be like, well,
Absolutely.
It's
Absolutely.
between him and God, and he needs to figure it out.
All right, now, let's try to get this back so we can keep going. All right. So, there's a lot of, I'm going to say a lot about data points, and the reason is we want to go from the text. So we're going to start collecting stuff that the book actually says about Job and trying to build up this picture. So the first place that we have to start, at a certain point, it just gets pitifully comic. Job is clearly righteous. So whatever else we have to conclude about Job, Job is clearly righteous by whatever terms righteous is defined in Job. And it is helpful to know, in Ezekiel 14, God tells Ezekiel twice that Jerusalem's in so much trouble that even if Noah, Daniel, and Job were living in Jerusalem, their prayers would only be able to save themselves, not anybody else. James uses Job as an example of godly perseverance. God clearly considers Job righteous. He clearly was, in some sense. Now, it's helpful that we can tell how it's defined for purposes of Job. It's defined quite clearly as fearing God and shunning evil. Okay, that's what God says. Have you seen my servant Job? He fears me, he shuns evil. That definition doesn't include anything about loving God. And God does not say to Satan, have you seen my servant God? Have you seen how much he loves me? But he does say, have you seen my servant Job, that he fears me and shuns evil? Now, Job clearly does wind up saying, God has wronged me. He says that explicitly in Job 19:6. Furthermore, the narrator, Jethro, clearly considers that saying God has wronged me is a sin, because at the end of the first two chapters, he sums up the end result of Satan's attacks on Job by saying, in all this, Job did not sin by accusing God of wrongdoing. So, number one, it's clearly a sin for Job to accuse God of wrongdoing. And although he doesn't at first, he clearly winds up accusing God of injustice halfway through. And he is clearly rebuked by God for that presumption. God says, "Would you condemn me in order to justify yourself?" And it's a rhetorical question that obviously means that's exactly what you have done. All right? But God still says that he's righteous. God still, at the end, he doesn't punish Job, right? You notice that? Job gets this big, long, 4-chapter lecture on humility treatment. But God doesn't say, "And now, since you have sinned by accusing me of wrongdoing, you need to sacrifice a bull so that I will forgive you." Right? Job doesn't get punished. Job humbles himself. Fine. Problem solved. Problem resolved. We just keep going. His friends get punished. Right? Or his friends would get punished if they didn't commit a sacrifice, if they didn't get a sacrifice. All right? So there's a problem with Job's attitude, but it's not a problem that causes him to be unrighteous by the terms of this defined. Okay? This is also important. We have to remember that the philosophical categories that we think of omniscience and so forth weren't nearly as clearly defined in the minds of God's servants at the time. Job says, look, there's stuff that happens that ought not happen. Okay? First of all, I shouldn't be suffering because I haven't done anything wrong. And secondly, every so often you see people who should suffer and they die peacefully in their sleep, having lived an entire life long full of wealth and comfort, even though they were evil. So there are places where God lets something happen and he shouldn't. And yet, it is clear that Job's conviction is that God is fundamentally a righteous character. In other words, Job does not say, God is an unjust sadist. Job feels like God is a righteous God who for some reason is acting out of character. But Job feels, you know what it's like is that Job keeps saying, if I could just get a hearing and present my case, God would admit that I'm innocent. It's almost as if Job feels like God's confused about something, right? It's almost he feels like God's made a mistake, and if Job could just straighten him out, it would be fine because God doesn't mean to be unrighteous. Do you see what I mean? Job doesn't think that God is an unrighteous God. He thinks that this basically righteous God has for some weird reason done something unrighteous, but that the problem can be straightened out. And there's a big gap between that and saying God is not righteous. And there's a big gap between saying that and saying what Elihu kind of accuses Job of saying. Elihu says, Job says, there is no profit in pleasing God. That's not exactly right. What Job says is, there's plenty of profit in pleasing God most of the time. Something's wrong in my case. Right? So, he accuses God of doing something unjust. He does not accuse God of being an unjust God. And his conviction that God is fundamentally just never wavers. He just thinks there's a misunderstanding someplace in his case that he wants to get straightened out. Right? this is also pretty important. This contract view of religion, right? The sort of standard ancient view of religion, which is that the reason that you serve God, He blesses you. That's how it works. You serve God, your obligation is to serve God, God's obligation is to reward the just and punish the innocent. This is the theology that underlies Job's friends' lectures to him. And Job basically buys into it. Okay? And so he thinks that God is not keeping God's end up on the bargain. So the difference between Job and his friends is not that Job's friends think that God has an obligation to reward the just and punish the guilty. Job agrees with that. The difference is that Job's friends think that God always rewards the just, where we can see it, and always punishes the guilty. And Job, who I would say would have completely agreed with them right up until he was the one who was suffering. Job now is saying, yeah, but I didn't do anything. There's something wrong. But the underlying model, his underlying model for how God's supposed to treat people is exactly the same as theirs. Okay? And he consistently argues from that perspective. You can see Elihu kind of reaching for something beyond it, kind of incoherently, because Elihu is really, really furious and he's angry, and he doesn't construct his arguments very carefully. But you can see him kind of reaching for the idea that there's something beyond this, but Job never does. Okay? So Job thinks he's getting mistreated by God, but he keeps serving God. Okay? The way I would put this is that Job does not ace the test, but he gets a nice strong A. Right? You can wish that Job had not gotten sufficiently upset to accuse. You can wish that Job had not implicitly tried to condemn God in order to justify himself. But if you look at everything that Job got right, and then you ask yourself, how many people in this church, without the benefit of having read Romans, right, without the benefit of knowing the resurrection, how many of us would have gotten right what Job got right? The answer is, we would have wound up almost certainly like Job's wife. What Job accomplishes is staggering. Okay? He is a righteous man. He has some issues, but he is a righteous man. And so anything that we do has to work from that. Okay? But we have the issue of his pride and vanity. Job's piety was really public. Job spends a lot of time in chapter 30 and 31 talking about how nice it was back when everybody thought he was awesome. How nice it was when anytime he decided to talk, everybody else shut up and listened to him. You know, that he was the E.F. Hutton of Ur. He liked having everybody say, that's a really godly man. And he was very proud of how godly he was. And now we naturally react very badly to that. Okay? And we instantly think God resists the proud but gives grace to the humble. Right? We know that pride and self-righteousness are bad things. Okay? But Job doesn't have any awareness that there's anything wrong with being proud of obeying God if you obey God, which he clearly has. Also, Job loses his kids, he loses his wealth, he loses his health, and in none of that does he sin by accusing God of wrongdoing. But when he realizes that his friends think he is a sinner, and when he realizes that everybody thinks that he has committed some terrible sin, That he can't stand. And it is when he realizes that everybody else thinks, wow, whatever Job did, it must be really terrible. That he can't stand. Right? And it's only after his friends have kept saying, yeah, but you've got to be a sinner because look at your suffering, that he finally says, 19 chapters in, God has wronged me. Okay? So, his reputation is a huge, huge thing to him. It is the dominant theme that drives his behavior. If you read it, when he's saying, how I long for the days when everything was good, he doesn't say, when I had 10 children that I loved. He says, how I long for the days when I had the first seat in the marketplace, so to speak. Now, it is possible, you could take this, if you wanted, you could take this in the direction of saying that Job complains about the loss of his reputation and not his children, because the loss of his children hurt so badly he couldn't even mention them. Okay, and that is a possibility. So it's possible that he doesn't mention them because that hurt so badly he couldn't even verbalize it. So I don't want to put too much weight on this, but at the very least, his reputation is of immense value to him. Now, I put a question mark here because we're about to drag something in from the New Testament, which neither Job nor Jethro had read. But when instead of listening to the story of Job, you read his speeches, especially if you read them out loud, the book of Job should really be read out loud, so that you can hear the tones of voice that you're giving to people, and also so that you'll slow down and actually hear what's being said. It is really, really difficult not to read Job saying, how I long for the days when everybody, trusted my opinion, where everyone... Very, very difficult to read it and not think of Jesus talking in the Sermon on the Mount about people who do their acts of righteousness for the sake of their reputation. Okay, now, especially when he's talking about how he basically had the most important seat in the council, and Jesus is saying, they like to have the most important seats in the synagogue, right? It's very difficult, for me at least, to read Job's carryings on about how awesome it was when everybody thought he was the best person in Ur, and not think of this, right? When I went to the gate of the city and took my seat in the public square, the young men saw me and stepped aside, and the old men rose to their feet. The chief men refrained from speaking and covered their mouths with their hands. Right? Look at this. Whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me because I rescued the poor who cried for help. Right? When you give to the needy, do not announce it with trumpets, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and on the streets to be honored by others. Whoever heard me spoke well of me, and those who saw me commended me, because I rescued the poor who cried for help and the fatherless who had none to assist them. Job's attitude towards his righteousness doesn't do well at all by the standard of the Sermon on the Mount, which, of course, Job hadn't heard, all right? It's, without going into that, it is not at all difficult for me to imagine Job thanking God that he's not like that tax collector, right? Now they mock me, men younger than I, whose fathers I would have disdained to put with my sheepdogs. Job says that, and Job says that he says that in his defense, right? In his defense speech. When Job is trying to prove that he's not a sinner, he says this. Okay? But I cheated a couple of slides ago when I posted this. I don't know if you noticed, but there was an ellipsis. Right? And I said they like to have the most important seats in the synagogue and the places of honor. And then I said ... these men will be punished most severely. This is the difference between Job and the Pharisees. Because when you read Job's speech and you look at what Jesus has to say about the Pharisees, you kind of start feeling like Job was kind of a proto-Pharisee, right? Except that the Pharisees were actually hypocrites. The Pharisees loved to be thought of as being righteous people, but they didn't actually obey the law. And this goes back to what I was saying, that no matter how many problems we might have with Job's attitude, you've got to remember he was basically a righteous person. He did not devour widows' houses. So he has an attitude problem, but not an obedience problem. Do you see the difference? It's a critical difference. All right? In the law of Moses, there is no commandment, thou shalt not be proud of thy good deeds. In fact, the word pride only appears once in all the 5 books of Moses. The word pride actually, outside of Proverbs, doesn't appear all that often in the Old Testament at all. And whenever God condemns pride in the early part of the Old Testament, he's condemning the pride of the disobedience. The pride that is implicit in thinking that you can disobey God and get away with it. Okay? So, we have the Sermon on the Mount. We don't have any excuse if we run around being proud of our own righteousness. But Job has absolutely no idea that there might be anything wrong with being proud of your obedience to God if you're genuinely obedient, which he is, right? Job gets to the end and he says, I don't know what God's accusing me of, so I will just defend myself against anything he might be accusing me of. And he says, I haven't done this, I haven't done that, I haven't done that. You know something he doesn't say? He doesn't say, I've never been proud of my own righteousness, because it doesn't occur to him that that might be something that would make God angry. So Job's pride is an attitude problem, but it is not a place where Job is willfully disobeying God. It is a function of his ignorance of the full nature of righteousness as we know it, thanks to all of the revelation of the Scripture that has come through since Job was there. Right? So, there is one passage from the law, however, that might be relevant. The law doesn't mention pride. It does mention humility. Not very often. Only, I think, 5 times in the first 5 books of Moses does it even mention humility. And one of them, it's a parenthetical expression, that Moses was more humble than anybody else on the earth. And the reason they see fit to mention it is because Aaron and Miriam are saying, you're such an arrogant jerk, you think you're more important than anybody else. And so he says, actually, Moses was really humble. But you do have Deuteronomy 8, where 3 times in Deuteronomy 8, God says that he humbled the Israelites in the wilderness. And this passage in particular, I think that probably Jethro came after the law of Moses and knew the law of Moses well. And so it is possible that Jethro had this passage in mind, or at least thought of this passage when he wrote Job, because it is very, very difficult to think of a better summation of what happens to Job than to humble and test you so that in the end it might go well with you. So it is possible that We're supposed to think of that. It's possible that Jethro thought of it. What is clear is that it wouldn't have occurred to Job, who simply doesn't have any idea that God objects if you obey him and are proud of obeying him. All right? So, what God means, clearly, when he says, Job fears me and shuns evil, is he fears me and he shuns everything that he knows is evil. And since practically nobody does that, just doing that makes Job an absolute hero of the faith. Okay? It makes Job an astonishingly righteous man. If you are able to, if you genuinely fear God and you actually obey everything that you know God has commanded, you're a way better person than I am. Okay? That in itself is astonishing. But people don't like arrogant, self-righteous people. Right? It might well be that Job didn't realize that God does not like for you to be proud of your righteousness. But what Jethro knew perfectly well is that people don't like you to be proud of your righteousness. Okay? And again, we come to the book of Job and we are studying the Bible. And we're all interested in the relationship between Job and God. And that's mostly what we notice because that's why we're there. We're studying the Bible to learn about God. When Jethro told this story sitting around the fire, the people who were listening to him wanted to hear a story. Do you know Fiddler on the Roof? How many of you have seen Fiddler on the Roof, right? Obviously, Chevya spends a whole lot of time talking to God. Obviously, Chevya's relationship with God has a lot to do with how he reacts to his daughters. But the reason, what that story is fundamentally about, is it's about, there's the dialogue, right? The dialogue when his middle daughter is sitting at the train station about to go to Siberia, and we know they'll never see each other again. We know it's a permanent goodbye. And his daughter says, Papa, God knows when we will see each other again. And Chevya says, then we will leave it in his hands. Now, God is present in that conversation. But that story is about the love between Chevya and his daughters. And in fact, do you guys know the name of the short story that Fiddler on the Roof was based on? Anyone happen to know the name of the short story? Chevya's Daughters. So, this story is as much about people as it is about God. And it doesn't take any theological sophistication for you to know that if someone thinks he's a better person than you are, you don't usually like him. Right? Do you guys remember I meant to have this, I was going to read it to you, but we're low on time. Mark Twain has a passage in Life of the Mississippi where he talks about the town's model boy, the boy who never did anything wrong. He says he was the admiration of all the mothers and the detestation of all the sons. At the end of it he says, I heard what happened to him after he grew up, but I won't talk about it as it is displeasing to me. He succeeded in life. And you totally know what he's talking about how all the other boys couldn't stand this one boy, that every time they did anything wrong, what did their mother say? Why can't you be like, right? We've gone a long way in developing the theology of what pleases God. But what pleases other people is something that's never been a secret. Okay? Here's another thing. Job showed a whole lot of generosity to the deserving poor. But there's not much sign that he gave grace to sinners. This goes back to the very excellent point that Jocelyn made, right? Which is that generosity is nice. Patronization is infuriating, right? I'm gonna skip ahead, I put a slide in the wrong order. James, in James 1:6, I think. He says, if anyone lacks wisdom, he should ask God, who gives generously to all without finding fault. Meonididzos is the Greek, and it is a kind of hard thing to translate, but it basically means without insulting. He gives generously to all without insulting them. I at least know some people that they're very generous, but their generosity always comes with a lecture, right? That they're happy to help you from their status as a superior human being to you, right? And they're happy to help you as long as you're willing to listen to a lecture about how it's all your own fault that you need their help, right? I mean, do you know, I know people like, do you know people like that? I think James certainly did, because James is careful to say, okay, God's not like that, right? I kind of think Job was. And here's another thing. Can somebody read Job 4:1-3? This is the very first thing Eliphaz says, and nobody's mad at anybody yet. Most of the things that Job and his friends say to each other after Eliphaz's first speech makes Job mad. Job's answer to Eliphaz's first speech makes Eliphaz, Bildad, and Zophar mad. And everything that happens after that is angry people hurting each other's feelings. But nobody's mad yet at this first speech. So if there's anything that Eliphaz says that is going to make sense and not be poisoned by anger, it'll be the first speech. So what's the first thing he says? Does anyone have it?
Then Eliphaz the Temanite answered, if one ventures a word with you, will you become impatient? But who can refrain from speaking? Behold, you have admonished many, and you have strengthened the weak.
Right? Do you hear that? You have admonished many. Eliphaz and Bildad, Eliphaz certainly, and the rest, they come to Job. Look, they're not Job's friends nearly so much as they're his professional colleagues. Okay, we translate the word friend, but they are fellow wise people of respected opinions. Okay? Eliphaz perceives himself as coming to do for Job what Job has done for lots of other suffering people. Right? I mean, Job had a life before all this happened, and part of his life was he was a notoriously godly man. Right? He had the duties of notoriously godly men. And Eliphaz explicitly says, you've admonished many people. Now, Job says, in chapter 16, he says, look, if this were happening to you, I would give you comfort. You know, I wouldn't harsh on you with lectures. It's fine for Job to say that, but as it happens, we actually know exactly how Job treated people whom he had an obligation to love and who were undergoing horrific suffering. Job loses all 10 of his children. I said in week 1, by the way, 14, because I hadn't looked it up, and it's 10. It's 7 sons and 3 daughters. Job loses his 10 grown children all at a whack. Loses all of his wealth. You know who else loses 10 children all at a whack? Job's wife. And what's more, Job can, and ultimately does, get more children. Because if you're a man, you can have children till you're 80 if you want. Job's wife already had 10 grown children. She's not getting any more. her loss is irrevocable. And when Job's wife complains to Job out of bitterness and pain, Job insults her and lectures her. You are talking like a fool. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? What Job does to his wife is exactly what Job's friends do to him. There is no gentleness in this at all. And you know what? That is a very good and accurate theological statement. That is very admirable theology. And it is the wrong time and the wrong place. Okay? Job's friends think that he is talking like an immoral person. And they have lots of valuable theology to provide. So they come to their friend who is hurting and is saying things that don't sound very godly to them, and they straighten him out with a lecture. And Job says, well, if it was you, I would never talk to you like that. That's what he said to his wife. And Eliphaz starts off by basically saying, you've given plenty of lectures to people who are suffering, and that's a good thing. You should have done that. So we're here to do you the same favor that you have done for others. And let's think for a moment about Job's friends. They get mad really fast. Why is that? So I said before, why do people not love Job? What might be reasons people don't love Job? Why, more specifically, Job's friends get there and they start talking to him, and it pretty much instantly degenerates into something really nasty and ugly. And everybody gets mad at everybody, and they go there almost instantly. Why? Why are Job's friends so ready to get mad at him?
It's been building up for a while.
Oh, okay. I like that. Why? What is it that's been building up?
Just felt like they just see the way he treats others, and that they've never had the chance to actually tell them all.
Well, I think you're on the right track. Right? It's not so much that they see the way he treats others and they think there's anything wrong with it, right? But when they do the same thing to him that he's done to other people, and then he throws a fit about it, right? Don't you think that would make you feel like, yeah, you can dish it out but you can't take it, kind of thing? Why are you getting mad at us? We're just trying to help you. Right? If this is how he's tried to help other people in the past, and then they try to do the same thing for him, and all of a sudden he's like, oh, you people are terrible friends. Well, you can see how that would be annoying, right? And he does go straight to, you people are bad friends, and we're just trying to help, right? So you can see how that would make people mad. But if Eliphaz is telling the truth when he says, we're just trying to do for you what you've done for other people, and I think he is, because they're doing for him what Job did for his wife. Right? I don't think Eliphaz is lying when he says, we're here to condole with you, sort of like Mr. Collins. I think also, since they are sure that he has done some terrible sin, again, because I think they are mostly, now this is I think, but they seem to me to be colleagues more than friends. Right? So if their relationship is based on we're the good guys, and it turns out he's really one of the bad guys, you can see him being angry about that. I don't know whether that's what's happened or not, but that's a possibility. This, I think, is very much in play. they all respected each other and they all thought they were righteous. Now it turns out that Job's actually a terrible, hideous sinner. And so they come to straighten him out. And to their astonishment, instead of thanking them for straightening him out, he tells them that they're stupid, that they don't know anything, that they don't know anything about God. That doesn't sit well with them, I don't think. Eliphaz, and I don't want to take a lot of time on this because we're short on time. If you get a chance, read Eliphaz's first speech of the day. And Eliphaz is the one who gets maddest. Eliphaz is the one who was like frothing at the mouth by the end of it. He was accusing Job of, well, you never took care of your relatives and you've turned your nose up. I mean, he's accusing Job of things that are obviously not true, that everybody knows that is not true. So he's basically gone gibberingly insane with fury. Eliphaz is the one who gets really, really angry. Eliphaz is also the one who starts out claiming that, you know, God visits him in dreams and gives him visions, right? You can play with this. I think it's entirely possible that Eliphaz has spent a lot of time hearing people talk about how great Job is, and Eliphaz has spent a lot of time sitting around saying, I'm as good as Job is. Again, maybe that's true, maybe it isn't. Eliphaz certainly is the one who goes gibberingly mad with rage, and Eliphaz is also the one who claims special spiritual insight that nobody else has. Right? But I think the main takeaway is Eliphaz says, we're not doing anything, basically says, we're not doing anything to you that you haven't done to other people, and I think he's probably telling the truth. Okay? They think that they are doing Job a favor. I think Job, before it was him, probably thought he was doing people a favor. I think Job presumably thought he was doing his wife a favor with that speech. If he had, and by the way, if Job's speech to his wife had any impact at all, what was it? Do we ever see any sign that she repented? Did she ever had any restoration of her relationship with God? I don't know what Job expected to accomplish. If what he expected to accomplish was comforting her, I can't imagine that he did. If what he expected to accomplish was to bring her to repentance, there doesn't seem to be any sign that he did. That speech appears to have accomplished nothing at all of any actual value, except to make it clear that Job was not going to reject the bad stuff that came from God after he had taken the good stuff. But as far as its actual impact on his wife, I mean, if that was you, and in that situation your husband said that to you, what effect do you think that would have? Right? So, you can give Job's friends a hard time all you want, and I'm fine with that, as long as you also have something to say about how Job treats his wife. Okay? So, here's how I'd play Job. We have like 3 minutes. So this is just how I would play Job. I'm going to run through it fast because, do you know what I really want? What I really want is the last slide, which is where I want you guys to go home and then come back and tell me why I'm wrong. And tell me how you would play Job. Right? I've pointed to a lot of stuff in the text, which is where I derive my view of Job's personality. Okay? The stuff that's in the text is really there, but there's a lot of extrapolation. Alright? It would be a really good thing for you to go do your own extrapolation and see to what extent you wind up agreeing and to what extent you don't. Just the interaction with the text will do a tremendous amount for you, so this will go fast. He genuinely fears God. He genuinely shuns evil. Okay? But he is really proud of what a good guy he is, and he is pretty obnoxious about it. Because he doesn't have any awareness that there's anything wrong with being obnoxious about it, and because Job appears to me to not have a whole lot of emotional intelligence, just not much of a grasp. Job seems to be genuinely astonished that everybody has turned against him. If everybody turns against you, if not even one person stands by you, then probably something about the way you're dealing with people is suboptimal. All right? everybody's gonna have some people who let you down, but most of us will have one or two good friends, especially if we've been good people for 50 years and have spent our lives helping other people. Some of those people will show up for us. Nobody did for Job. There's probably some issue. But Job, in that speech, he's like, everybody loved me so much, and the widows just thought I was awesome, except none of them show up when he needs them, right? So I think he's pretty clueless about other people. I think he kind of felt like you always had to be on your best behavior around him. Right? I don't think he was necessarily a comfortable person to be around. I think he really was. I think Job really was just like his friends, except that he was genuinely righteous. Okay? So I think that Job genuinely obeyed God more than his friends did. But I think Job treated other people the way his friends did. I think Job and his friends treated people similarly, and that Job is really getting from his friends a lot of his own medicine. There's no evidence that Job loves God. This is Telia's Daughters, right? That is a movie about love and love in the family. Job is almost a book about the absence of love. There's hardly anybody in this book who loves anybody else, right? And Job obeys God, but there's no sign that he loves God. Job serves God because Job thinks of himself as a righteous, godly person. And he doesn't want to give that up. And he likes for other people to think of it too. So I think Job's nice, comfortable little world falls apart when he's the one who suffers. Let's see. This is what I want to emphasize. If you're genuinely righteous and you're genuinely humble, right, then you are loved.
I have to play the devil's advocate.
Yeah, but by all means. Hey, hang on just a second.
Yeah,
Because we're like a minute past.
sure.
So, playing devil's advocate is exactly what I want you guys to do. Alright? So, go for a minute. I know that's not enough time. I didn't leave enough time. I'm sorry. And we can pick it up at the start of next week too.
I think in general, I think that Job himself, when he's under this, first of all, his whole family dies except for his wife. So I mean, you can't expect his wife. They're gone. I mean, he doesn't have anybody to come to him. That's my feeling. And he does have friends. He had friends that actually came to him. He had 3 friends that came. When I think about my situation, I think I've shared this to you guys before. There were a couple of people. Let me share things that 2 people have said to me. Okay, regarding when they came to comfort me, regarding the death of my daughter. Okay, one person was, I told you, was a person who at the time was going to seminary. He came over and basically said to me that, he tried to comfort me and so forth, and I said that, my daughter, hopefully we'll see her, in heaven, and be reunited in that sense. And he said that, hopefully, you guys will, God willing, if she was a Christian, then perhaps you guys will. So that was his response. And there was another person who came and said that, actually many people who would say that, just wanted to say that, you're a great inspiration and just so forth, or, you and your family really helped, her death really helped out, my life and just all that, okay? So I think that the first person, okay, who said what they said to me, is very obvious how insensitive that was, okay? The second person, on the other hand, and of course, I was obviously very irritated with the first person. With the second person, I was also irritated. Why was I irritated? Well, it's because I'm like, so God killed my child so that it can further your understanding, your sense of, self or whatever? Is that supposed to help me? You know what I'm saying? Okay, so the whole time I'm thinking, all these people meant the best for me. They meant 100%, you know what I mean, or whatever. But that you know what I mean, I reacted in the way that, because of the situation that I'm at. So I really see a lot of what's happening here in Job in the very similar context of what's going on. I think that their friends really meant, a lot of good towards Job. You know what I'm saying? But Job, in response, is, reacting to some of those sensitivities that, for instance, if you did not ever have to go through that situation, you're a third party standing there, you'd be like, what's the big deal? Yeah, this person is, the first person is like, yeah, they're like, technically correct, or just whatever, theologically correct. But, if you're not in there with those kinds of feelings, if you cannot empathize, if you cannot extrapolate, what those words mean, you know what I mean? But I extended a lot of, obviously, you have to extend a lot of grace towards these people. You have to understand that these people have never been in that situation. They're not going to understand. They didn't mean evil towards me. Anyways, I just wanted to share that.
Thank you. Thank you. I actually want to start there when we come back next week. Okay? And for 5 minutes over. So I want to start with thank you very much. Because that's let's just start there next week. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for the gift of the story of Job. And we pray that we would be faithful to the text and faithful to your intent, and open to being enriched in not just in theological understanding, but in compassion, and empathy, and in understanding grief and tragedy. And we ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.